She told a mafia boss to get out of her inn, and she didn't even look up from her ledger when she said it. Grant Corsetti was 36 years old, 6'2", and worth more money than most people could count in a lifetime. The kind of man whose name made prosecutors lose their appetite and rivals lose their nerve. He controlled half the eastern seaboard's shipping ports through shell companies and quiet violence. He had a penthouse on the Upper East Side, and he hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since his younger brother Tommy had died 5 weeks ago from a brain aneurysm that burst while the kid was eating breakfast alone in his Brooklyn apartment. No enemies, no warnings, just a 28-year-old architect, found 6 hours later by a delivery driver who knocked and got no answer. Grant had stood at the funeral in a $10,000 suit and said all the right things. Then he'd gotten into his black Maybach and driven through 3 states without stopping, without eating, without knowing where he was going, because the truth was he wasn't going anywhere. He was trying to outrun a penthouse that was too quiet, and a white coffee mug still sitting on Tommy's counter with dried coffee at the bottom that he couldn't wash, because washing it meant that last morning was really over. That's when he found the Wren's Nest, a small wooden inn at the edge of a town called Harlow Falls. Light in the windows, a hand-painted sign fading in the weather. He walked in expecting what he always got: deference, attention, a room made ready before he'd finished asking. What he got was Felicity Avery, 27, dark hair pinned back, flower on her wrist, writing numbers in a ledger behind the counter, and she didn't stop writing when the door opened. He asked for the best room, put a stack of cash on the counter thick enough to buy the whole building. She looked at the money, looked at him 2 seconds, that's all it took, and said, "We don't have any rooms available." 4 keys were hanging on the wall right behind her. He could count. She could see him counting. She didn't care. Here's what you need to understand about Felicity Avery. She'd been running this inn alone since she was 19, since her father's heart began to fail so severely that someone had to hold everything together. So she just did. She kept the books. She paid the bank what she could, and begged them to wait for the rest. She ate leftovers after the guests were done, and she hadn't taken a single day off in 8 years. The only help she had was Owen, a young local boy she hired to handle the heavy chores around the property. But the real weight of the inn still rested entirely on her shoulders. She didn't need a man throwing cash on her counter like he was doing her a favor. But here's where the story turns. He didn't leave. He put the money away, and something in his voice changed, and he said, "I don't need the best room. I just need any room." And for the first time, she looked, and what she saw behind the expensive suit and the unshaved jaw wasn't arrogance anymore. It was exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something so heavy you've forgotten what your shoulders felt like without it. She gave him the smallest room in the house, $60 a night. Didn't touch the cash. He was supposed to leave the next morning. He stayed 9 days, and what happened during those 9 days is going to change both their lives in ways neither of them saw coming. But I'll get to that. If this story's already got you hooked, hit that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs a good story tonight, and subscribe if you haven't. You don't want to miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that first morning, when Grant Corsetti came downstairs expecting to leave and found a cup of coffee that made him stay. The next morning, Grant woke at 7:30, and for the first moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling was low, the walls were wood, the sheets carried the scent of lavender, and early sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, casting a golden stripe across the bedroom floor. He lay still for a long while. There were no car horns, no elevator sounds, none of the heavy silence of the penthouse where every room echoed with the presence of someone who was no longer there. This place was quiet in a different way. Quiet like a place that was breathing. He went downstairs with the intention of paying his bill and driving away before 8 o'clock. That intention lasted about 15 steps. The inn's parlor in the morning was an entirely different place from the night before. Sunlight poured through the 2 east-facing windows and fell across the old wooden floor, making it glow warm as honey. The fireplace had been lit again early, and the smell of coffee mingled with bacon and toast, filling the entire ground floor in a way that didn't feel like a meal, but like a reason not to leave. An old man sat in the armchair beside the fireplace, reading the local newspaper with the concentration of someone who had turned that act into a profession. Only later did Grant learn that his name was Aldrich, that he was 72 years old, a former literature professor at a small college outside Albany, retired for 6 years, and renting a room long-term at the inn, because he liked the quiet, liked Fell's cooking, and liked the fact that no one bothered him except the weather. Aldrich looked up when Grant appeared, gave a single nod in the manner of a man acknowledging another person's existence without requiring any conversation from him, then returned to his newspaper. Grant found himself appreciating that more than any greeting he had received in the past 5 years. Fel was behind the counter. She was writing in the ledger, her pen moving steadily across the page, and she didn't look up when he sat down at the table near the window. "Breakfast?" she asked, her eyes still on the ledger. "Yes." She brought it out herself. An omelet, bacon, toast, and a pot of coffee that made Grant take his first sip and stop. He had eaten in the finest restaurants in Manhattan, places where 1 cup of coffee cost $18 and was served by someone who considered it art. This coffee was better. He didn't understand why, and he didn't try to understand. He simply took a second sip. Fel set the plate down with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times and would do it thousands more, then went back to the counter. "Will you be checking out this morning?" she asked. There was no pressure in the question, and no invitation either. She was only confirming a fact. "I think I'll stay another night," he heard himself say. "If the room is available." "The room is available," she said, and that was that. He stayed a second night, Monday morning, the same sequence. Coffee, bacon, a polite question, and an answer he hadn't planned in advance at all. He stayed a third night. By Wednesday morning, Fel stopped asking, and Grant realized what had kept him there. It wasn't the room, though it was comfortable enough. It wasn't the food, though it was surprisingly good. It was this. The inn demanded nothing from him. No one asked for his real name beyond the name he had registered under. Just Brennan. No one asked what he did for a living. No one asked why a man in an expensive suit, driving $1 million car, was staying in the smallest room and showing no sign of leaving. Aldrich nodded to him every morning and occasionally commented on the weather. That was the full extent of social obligation in this place. And then there was Felicity Avery. She ran the inn. That became clear within the first few hours of watching her, and it was confirmed completely in the days that followed. Grant didn't know exactly what time Fel woke up, but every morning when he came downstairs at 6:30 or 7 o'clock, everything was already done. The tables and chairs had been wiped down, the floor had been swept, the fireplace had been lit again, and flowers still clung to her arms from the batch of bread she had finished kneading before any guest had opened their eyes. The ledger on the counter was already filled with the day's figures in handwriting so precise it looked printed. The pot of stew for dinner had begun simmering early on the stove in the back. The inn opened its eyes each day in a state of having already been cared for. And that was Fel's work. And it had been her work for many years, and no one thanked her for it, because it was done so seamlessly that it looked as if it happened on its own. Her father appeared on the second day Grant stayed there. Walt Avery sat in his wheelchair on the back porch, a thick book resting on his lap, a blanket over his legs even though the weather wasn't very cold. He was 72 years old, his face thin, but his eyes bright and alert, in the way of a man whose body had abandoned him, though his mind had not. He greeted Grant with a voice that was warm and genuinely kind, asked if the weather on the road was pleasant, asked if Grant had found the road north beautiful this time of year. Ordinary questions, but while his mouth spoke about the weather, his eyes were reading Grant. And he read him accurately. Grant recognized that because he had spent his entire life sitting across from people trying to read him, and most of them had failed, Walt Avery didn't fail. He saw something in Grant, and what he saw didn't frighten him, but it didn't leave him entirely at ease either, and he kept both of those things to himself. Grant respected him for that. Then there were things Grant saw that he wished he hadn't seen. On the afternoon of the third day, he passed the back kitchen and heard Fel's voice on the phone. She was talking to someone, her voice calm but careful, the kind of calm that belonged to someone who had been forced to say this same sentence many times before. "I understand, Dr. Kessler. I'll pay last month's portion on Friday. I just need 2 more weeks for the rest." Silence. "Yes, my father is still taking his medication regularly. Yes. Thank you, doctor." She hung up. Grant stood in the hallway, and he didn't walk in, didn't say anything, didn't let her know he had heard, but he remembered. He began remembering everything. The shoes she wore every day, old brown leather shoes with heels so worn down they tilted when she stood. Grant saw it, but he said nothing. The way she served dinner to the guests first and only sat down to eat afterward, always last, always with the smallest portion, and if a guest asked for something more, she would get up halfway through her meal without the faintest sign of irritation. Grant noticed this because he had watched closely enough, and he had watched closely enough because there was something about Fel as a person that made it impossible for him not to look. She didn't perform competence. She simply was competent. She moved through each day with an efficiency so nearly invisible that it only became clear when you stayed still long enough to realize how many things were being managed at once by the same person. Cooking, cleaning, bookkeeping, her father's medical bills, Owen, the guests, the leaking roof in the corner of the second-floor hallway, where she set out a bucket every time it rained, all of it alone. And by the end of the 4th day, Grant Corsetti, the man who had run an empire stretching across half of America's East Coast, began to understand that she was running an empire of her own, infinitely smaller, but demanding the same thing, everything she had, every day, without rest. On the 5th day, Grant fixed the stair. The 3rd step from the bottom had rotted through, creaking every time someone stepped on it, and he had heard that sound for 4 days straight, every time Fel carried bed linens up to the 2nd floor, every time Owen ran downstairs to get something from storage. It wasn't only irritating, it was dangerous, especially in an inn where an old man in a wheelchair lived on the ground floor, and a 27-year-old woman went up and down the stairs a dozen times a day. He didn't ask permission. He found the toolbox in the storage room behind the kitchen and assessed the problem. The board had rotted from the inside because of dampness, and the lower hinge was loose too. He replaced the board and tightened the hinge in 30 minutes. He knew how to use tools, and it wasn't the skill of a rich man playing around on weekends for amusement, but something older, belonging to another version of Grant Corsetti, the version that had existed before the penthouse and before the empire. When Fel crossed the stairs an hour later, her foot touched the 3rd step, and the step didn't creak. She stopped, maybe for half a second. She looked down at the new board, then looked toward the parlor, where Grant was sitting and reading an old book he had taken from the shelf. She said nothing. No thank you. No comment. No question about who had given him permission to touch her stairs. She continued up to the 2nd floor and disappeared. Dinner that night, Grant's portion was noticeably larger. More meat, an extra slice of bread, and a serving of stewed vegetables he hadn't seen on his plate in the previous days. She didn't explain why. He didn't ask. They both understood. On the 6th day, the delivery truck arrived. Owen was busy dealing with the inn's small truck, which had gotten a flat tire halfway to town, and Fel was hauling crates from the delivery truck to the storage room by herself. Grant watched her carry the 2nd crate. She probably weighed less than 60 kilos, and the crate looked as if it weighed half as much as she did. He stood without saying anything, walked out into the yard, and began carrying crates with her. They worked side by side in silence, one crate after another, and Fel neither thanked him nor objected. She simply kept moving at the same steady pace, as if help were a weather condition she accepted but didn't rely on. On the 7th day, a traveling merchant stopped in for a drink and drank more than he needed. He began raising his voice at Owen because the boy had brought the wrong beer. Then the raised voice became shouting, and the shouting moved dangerously close to violence when the man slapped his hand down on the table. Owen stepped back half a pace, not yet knowing how to handle it. Fel was in the kitchen. Grant didn't stand quickly. He stood slowly, and something in the way he rose, the way his shoulders turned toward the merchant, the way his eyes looked straight at him without blinking and without raising his voice at all, delivered a wordless message that the matter had just ended. The merchant sat down. Owen looked at Grant with wide eyes. Aldrich lifted his newspaper a little higher to hide something that looked very much like a smile. Fel had come back from the kitchen just early enough to witness the whole thing. Her expression didn't change, but that evening, when Grant sat at his usual table by the window, she placed a glass of liquor in front of him, something he had never seen her pour for anyone else. The bottle was kept on the highest shelf behind the counter, and in the 6 days he had watched, not one guest had been allowed to touch it. She set the glass down and said, the first private observation she had ever offered him, "You're not a merchant." "No." "And you're not in trouble with the law." "No." She stood still for a while, her eyes on him with the sharp and quiet gaze of someone who had seen all kinds of men pass through this doorway and had learned how to classify them faster than most people. Then she said, "Then you're running from yourself. That kind is usually much worse." She cleared his plate and disappeared into the kitchen before he could answer. And Grant remained there alone with the fine liquor, the fire in the hearth, and the silence of a room carefully tended, and he thought that Felicity Avery might be the sharpest woman he had ever met in his life. It happened on the 9th day. Grant was in the back garden, the small patch of land behind the inn where Fel grew herbs and a few beds of vegetables in neat rows. He was helping her harvest basil and thyme, not because she had asked, but because he had been here long enough to understand that when there was work to be done, you simply did it, and Fel wouldn't thank him, but she wouldn't stop him either. They worked in silence, the kind of silence that had become familiar between them, and the late summer afternoon laid a golden light over the garden in a way that was almost peaceful. Then came the sound of a car, not the ordinary sound of a car passing through town. This was a large, heavy engine, the kind that belonged to a luxury SUV, and it stopped right in front of the inn yard with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Grant straightened in the middle of the vegetable bed. His hand was still holding a bunch of thyme, but everything else about him had changed. The way his shoulders tightened, the way his eyes turned toward the corner of the building where the road led into the yard, and in that moment, he no longer looked like the man who had fixed the stair and carried crates all week. He looked like himself. Footsteps sounded on the gravel. Then a voice. Grant recognized the voice before he saw the man. Shaw, 41 years old, a former Marine, 13 years working for Grant, and right now, his voice carried the very particular tone of a man who had searched for his boss across 3 states for weeks, and was trying with all his strength not to show the irritation that had gathered with every mile of the road. Grant walked around to the front of the building. Shaw stood in the middle of the yard, road dust on his shoulders, tired but still upright with the kind of military habit that never truly disappeared. The black SUV was parked behind him, its engine still running. Fel stood in the doorway of the inn, arms folded across her chest, assessing the newly arrived man with the unhurried gaze she gave everything. Shaw saw Grant, and relief flickered across his face for a fraction of a second, before discipline pulled it back into place. Then Shaw spoke, and he spoke loudly enough, not because he wanted everyone to hear, but because the situation had moved beyond the point of being kept discreet. Mr. Corsetti. Those 2 words fell into the quiet space of the inn like a stone thrown into still water. Petrov has taken over 2 ports. The council held an emergency meeting last night. They need you. The silence that followed was very specific, very different from the inn's usual silence. Aldrich looked up from his newspaper for the first time in the 9 days Grant had seen him truly look up for something that wasn't the weather. Owen, carrying a tray of plates out from the kitchen, stopped halfway, both hands still holding the tray while his eyes fixed on the strange man and the name that had just been spoken. Corsetti. Anyone who lived in New York State and read the news knew that name. It appeared in articles about seaports and international trade, in hearings that never went anywhere, in whispered stories about the East Coast underworld that everyone knew was real, but no one could prove. And now that name was standing in the yard of a small inn in Harlow Falls, with garden soil still on his hands, beside the basil bed of a 27-year-old innkeeper. Fel stood in the doorway. She had heard every word clearly. She looked at the man who had fixed her stair, carried crates for her, stood up and silenced a drunk to protect her employee, and sat eating in her kitchen every evening for 9 days. And she knew, or perhaps she had known long before this moment, that he was Grant Corsetti, the head of one of the most powerful families on the east coast of the United States, a man whose fortune was probably larger than the entire town of Harlow Falls put together. Her face didn't change by a single degree. Fel spoke before anyone else had time to react. "Your man needs dinner," she said to Grant, her voice calm, as if Shaw were only another guest stepping in from the road late in the afternoon. "And a room. I'll put him in the room next to yours." She turned to Shaw, looked the man over from head to toe for about 1 second, then added, "A small room." And Grant, even while standing in the yard with garden soil on his hands and his identity stripped bare in front of everyone, realized that it might have been humor. She went inside. Shaw watched her go with the expression of a man who had just encountered something he didn't entirely understand. "She gave you the best room?" Shaw asked after he had been shown to his own room, a small, clean room that was perfectly adequate. "She gave me the smallest room," Grant said. $60. Shaw looked at him. "And she knows who you are?" "I think she's known since about the 2nd night." Shaw silently processed that information for a few seconds, then said very carefully, "She's a special woman." "Yes," Grant replied. Dinner that night, Fel served as she always did. The same beef and vegetable stew, the same bread, the same efficiency without a single unnecessary gesture. She didn't call Grant by a different name. She didn't call him Mr. Corsetti. didn't change her attitude, didn't become submissive, didn't grow curious. She treated him exactly as she had treated him from the first night, like a man who had come in out of the rain and needed to be fed. The only change Grant could recognize was when she poured the liquor. She poured Shaw the regular kind, the kind she served every guest at the inn, without anyone needing to tell her. She had automatically ranked the hierarchy in Grant's world and placed herself entirely outside it. Shaw was Grant's man, so Shaw was treated like an ordinary guest. Grant was treated like Grant, not because he was a boss, but because he had fixed the stair. That distinction said everything. After dinner, when Fell had finished clearing up and withdrawn into the kitchen, Shaw and Grant sat alone in the upstairs room. Shaw reported, and for the first time in 9 days, the world outside the inn touched Grant with its real weight. Leon Petrov had taken over 2 container ports in New Jersey through a network of intermediaries. 3 longtime business partners of the Corsetti family had switched sides, not because Petrov was stronger, but because Grant had disappeared, and they were betting on his absence. The council, the heads of the family's branches, had held 2 emergency meetings over the past week, and their patience was running out faster than Shaw wanted to admit. "If you don't come back within a week," Shaw said bluntly, because he was the only man in the world who dared speak bluntly to Grant Corsetti, "you may lose more than 2 ports. You may lose your seat." Grant listened to it all. He listened to every detail, every number, every name. But the reaction Shaw expected didn't come. The familiar coldness, the ruthless sharpness Shaw had witnessed for 13 years. The thing that made enemies shrink and subordinates carry out orders without needing to ask twice, that hadn't fully returned. It was somewhere underneath. Shaw could feel it, but it was covered by something Shaw had never seen in his boss before. Something had changed in 9 days at this small inn, and Shaw didn't yet know what it was. Grant sat still for a long while after Shaw finished his report. Then he said, "She knows exactly who I am, Shaw. I can see it in her eyes. She figured it out early on. Yet she still charged me $60 a night, gave me the smallest room, and didn't change a single thing about the way she looked at me." Shaw said nothing. "She's extraordinary," Grant said, and it wasn't an observation. It was a truth, spoken in the voice of a man who had recognized it long ago but was only now admitting it aloud. The message came the next morning, on the burner phone Shaw had brought with him. Catherine Corsetti, Grant's mother, 63 years old, the widow of the previous boss, a woman who never wrote at length when she could write briefly. Her message was as clean as a gunshot. "Shaw says you're staying at some country inn. I won't pretend to understand. Petrov is eating away at the inheritance your father left behind. Tommy's matter isn't over. I'm not telling you to stop hurting. I'm telling you to come home, where that pain can be useful." Grant read the message at 7 o'clock in the morning, read it again at lunch, then read it once more beside the fireplace in the late afternoon, while Aldrich turned the pages of his newspaper beside him and asked nothing. He folded the phone shut, opened it again, and read it one more time. The message wasn't cruel. His mother wasn't cruel. She was only precise, and she was right, and Grant had known she was right for weeks, but he had kept avoiding it because avoidance was easier than facing it, and he knew that, and knowing didn't help. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Grant went down to the kitchen. The inn was silent except for the private sounds of the old building breathing in the night, the creak of wood, the wind slipping through the gap by the back door. He expected to find the parlor empty, but a faint light glowed from the kitchen. Fell was there. She was always there before dawn. He had learned that by now. Her hands were in the dough, her arms dusted white to the elbows, and there was a streak of flour along her jaw that she either didn't know about or didn't care about. On the table stood a candle instead of the overhead light, because the kitchen bulb had burned out and she didn't yet have the money to replace it. The kitchen was warm, scented with yeast and the herbs hanging from the rack, and the candlelight threw both of their shadows against the whitewashed wall, long and soft. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "You're leaving," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." She nodded once and kept kneading. The dough folded beneath her hands with the rhythm of years of repetition. Grant stepped into the kitchen. The stone floor, cold beneath his feet, stood beside the work table, and spoke, not because she had asked, but precisely because she was the only person who hadn't asked, and that made him want to tell her. "My brother's name was Tommy, 28 years old, an architect. He designed social housing because he wanted to build something instead of destroy. He died while eating breakfast alone. A blood vessel in his head burst. The delivery man found him 6 hours later. Fell's hands slowed, but they didn't stop. His white coffee cup was still on his kitchen table. The coffee had dried into a brown stain at the bottom. I didn't wash it, because washing it would mean that final morning was truly over. Silence. The candle flickered. I could kill anyone who threatened him, Grant said, his voice not trembling, but heavier than any words he had ever spoken before the council or before an enemy. All my life, I kept him safe, but I couldn't kill a blood vessel in his head. Fell's hands stopped completely. She stood still, her fingers pressed into the dough, her eyes on the tabletop, and she was very quiet. I came here because I got caught in the rain, he said. I stayed because of something else. Because you gave me the smallest room, charged me the exact price, and never once asked me to explain. And I couldn't leave because you're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. And I don't want to be anywhere that doesn't have you in it. The kitchen was very still. The fire murmured softly in the stove. Outside, a bird began to sing in the gray light before dawn. Fell looked up. Her eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them he hadn't seen before. Not exactly softness, but an opening, as if a door that had been firmly closed for years had been left slightly ajar. People say they'll come back, she said quietly. Guests, passers-by. They say it at the door after they've already put on their coats and started their cars. They mean it in that moment. Then the road carries them away, and they don't come back. I'm not a guest, Grant said. I fixed your stare. Something changed on Fell's face. Not a smile. Better than a smile. An acknowledgement that what he said was true. That she had noticed every hinge, every crate, every time he stood up and quieted trouble, and that those things mattered to her more than she had ever allowed herself to show. Then go home, she said. Go fix your own house, and when you're done, you'll know where to find me. He left the next morning. Shaw had prepared the car before dawn. The black SUV parked in the yard with its engine running quietly, and everything was ready in the way Shaw always prepared everything. Fast, clean, without needing to ask. Owen stood outside in the yard with both hands hanging at his sides, saying nothing, but he looked at Grant with the eyes of someone who had grown used to another person's presence, and then suddenly had to accept the absence. Aldrich sat in his chair by the fireplace, lifting his newspaper a little higher as Grant passed. A gesture that could have been a greeting, could have been a farewell, could have been both, and that was all the old man needed to say. Walt sat in his wheelchair on the front porch, a blanket over his lap, though the morning wasn't cold, and when Grant stepped out, he raised both hands and took Grant's hand in his. You're always welcome here, my friend, Walt said, and the warmth in his voice made the title unnecessary. His eyes were still bright and sharp, and they looked at Grant with something far beyond courtesy, something closer to understanding between two men who had lost many things and were still trying to hold on to what remained. Fell stood in the doorway of the inn. She didn't come out into the yard. She didn't wave. She stood with a towel draped over her shoulder, her hair pinned up neatly as it was every day, her apron already on because her workday had begun 3 hours earlier, and she watched him walk toward the car. Just before he opened the car door, she said, "The room will still be available." "The cheap room?" he asked. "The smallest room," she said, "as it always is." He got into the car. Shaw drove. The inn grew smaller in the rearview mirror, then disappeared completely after the first bend, and the road stretched south. They drove for 2 hours before Shaw said anything at all. And what Shaw said was, "You'll go back." Not a question. Grant didn't answer. The penthouse on the Upper East Side was exactly as he had left it. Glass, steel, a view of Central Park spread out 15 floors below, and every room too large, too clean, too quiet. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor in a way footsteps at the inn never did, because the old wooden floors at Wren's Nest absorbed sound instead of throwing it back. He set his bag down in the primary bedroom, looked around the space that had belonged to him for more than 10 years, and felt like a guest in his own home. But this was where he needed to be, and there was work to do. Grant summoned the council that evening. 7 people sat around the oak table in the conference room behind the office of Corsetti Holdings in Midtown, and when Grant walked in, the room changed. Not because he wanted it to change, but because that was the nature of who he was in this world. He sat at the head of the table, and he didn't speak loudly. He spoke very softly, and everyone in the room stopped breathing, because when Grant Corsetti spoke softly, that was when he was most dangerous. He didn't order a war with Petrov. War cost money, cost men, and drew the attention of the FBI. He ordered a takeover. Petrov was merely testing the waters, pushing against the edges of the empire because he assumed Grant was paralyzed by grief. But Grant chose not to launch a full retaliation just yet. Instead, he quietly froze their operations, tightening security around his remaining assets to draw a hard, invisible line. He was biding his time and ensuring internal stability first, while Shaw went to deal privately with the 3 partners who had whispered of treason. Grant didn't ask for details. He didn't need to ask. Shaw returned after each meeting, and the last time there was blood on the left cuff of his pants, and no one on the council asked another question. Within 2 weeks, the internal bleeding of the family was contained, and a tense, temporary silence settled over the East Coast ports. The council fell silent again. The silence of people who had remembered why they feared their boss. The empire was stable, but every night, Grant sat in the penthouse. Central Park stretched below like a black carpet pricked with lights, and the room was still too large, still too quiet, and he thought of a small kitchen scented with yeast and candlelight, where a woman kneaded dough before dawn and said exactly what he needed to hear without him ever having to ask. In the second week after returning to Manhattan, Grant went to Tommy's apartment in Brooklyn. He had avoided this place since the funeral, 7 weeks earlier, when he had stood outside the door with the key in his hand and couldn't turn it. This time, he turned it. The apartment was small, on the 3rd floor of a brownstone in Park Slope, and it was still exactly as Tommy had left it. Architectural drawings were pinned to the living room wall. The affordable housing designs Tommy had worked on for the last 2 years of his life, precise and ambitious lines drawn by a 28-year-old man who believed he had time. Books stood on the shelves, arranged by subject rather than alphabetically, because Tommy had always said, knowledge should be organized by the way it connects, not by the way it's spelled. His running shoes were by the door. The laces still loosened the way Tommy always took off his shoes, pulling his feet out without bothering to bend down and untie them. Grant closed the door behind him and stood in his brother's apartment, and didn't move for a very long time. He sat down on the sofa. He looked at the drawings on the wall. He looked at the bookshelves and the running shoes and the photograph on the refrigerator. Tommy smiling in construction clothes during a visit to the first project that had been built. The smile of a man who knew he was doing the right thing. Then Grant took out his phone and called the lawyer. "I want to establish a charitable foundation," he said, in Tommy Corsetti's name. "A foundation focused on affordable housing. Use my brother's entire personal account as the starting capital. And I'll add more. I want the paperwork done this week." The lawyer asked a few questions. Grant answered briefly. He signed the documents by email that same afternoon. Tommy Corsetti Foundation for Affordable Housing. The name looked right. The name sounded right. Tommy would have liked it, or Tommy would have been embarrassed by it. Probably both. And both thoughts made Grant want to laugh and unable to. After that, he packed. Item by item. Carefully. Books into boxes, labeled, clothes folded neatly, not shoved into trash bags the way people often did when clearing out the belongings of the dead. The drawings were rolled up and placed inside preservation tubes. The running shoes, he wiped clean and placed in the original shoebox Tommy still kept on top of the closet. Every object he touched weighed more than its physical weight. Last came the mug, the white coffee mug on the kitchen table, the one he had thought about every day for the past 7 weeks. The dried coffee stain at the bottom, dark brown, the last trace of the final morning Tommy had been alive. Grant picked it up. He held it in his hand for a very long time, long enough for the afternoon light through the window to shift across the floor, and he felt its weight, absurdly light for something that had held him in place for nearly 2 months. Then he walked to the sink. He turned on the water, and he washed the mug, slowly, by hand. The water ran over the dried coffee stain and carried it away, the brown fading pale and then clear, and Grant washed until the white mug was completely clean. He dried it with a clean towel and brought it back to the penthouse and placed it on the shelf in his study, beside the photograph of Tommy in construction clothes. Clean, not erased, preserved. That night, he sent Catherine a message. "I'm going to marry." His mother answered within 3 minutes, brief as always, 4 words. "Who? Where?" Grant didn't answer right away. He sat in the study, looking at the white mug on the shelf beside Tommy's photograph, and for the first time in nearly 2 months, he knew exactly where he was going. He wasn't running anymore. He was moving toward a place. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday in early autumn, Grant drove toward Harlow Falls. This time, he drove alone, with Shaw following behind in another car at a distance, and the road was entirely different from the first time. There was no rain, no darkness. The leaves on the trees had begun to change, gold and orange and deep red along the narrow roads that cut through upstate New York. The pavement was dry. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, and everything, from the light to the air itself, stood in complete contrast to the rainy night more than a month earlier, when he had happened to stop at the small inn without knowing where he was going. This time, he knew. He arrived at Wren's Nest in the late afternoon. The inn looked different in the sunlight, smaller than he remembered, but warmer. The old wood glowing beneath the golden afternoon light, the hand-painted sign still faded, but now it looked like charm instead of weariness. He stopped the car in the yard and stepped out. Fell was in the back garden. She was cutting rosemary, scissors in one hand, a bundle of fragrant sprigs in the other. And when she heard the car, she looked up. She saw him. She stood still. And in that moment, they only looked at each other across the distance of the small garden, and 3 weeks apart, and everything that had changed in both of them, without needing to be spoken aloud. "Mr. Brennan," she said, the false name he had registered under on the first day, a private humor between the two of them. "Miss Avery," he replied. "I'd like to speak with your father." Fell understood at once. Something passed across her face. Surprise, or the shadow of surprise, controlled almost immediately. And she set the rosemary and the scissors down on the table with her usual precision. "He's in the parlor," she said. "He's been waiting for you. He said you'd come back on a Tuesday." "How did he know?" "He said Tuesday is the day serious men do serious things. I think he was teasing me." She stopped at the door. "He'll say yes. He made me promise to tell you ahead of time so you wouldn't be nervous." I told him, "You don't get nervous." He told me I don't know everything. The corner of her mouth moved in the smallest way possible. It seems he was right. Walt was sitting in his wheelchair beside the fireplace, a blanket over his legs, and he looked at Grant with the steady gaze of a man who had had 3 weeks to think and had reached his conclusion. "Mr. Corsetti," Walt said. It was the first time he used Grant's real name. "Sit down." Grant sat. "My daughter has been running this inn since she was 19 years old, Walt said. "She does it without complaining, without help, without ever saying her life could have been different. She has turned down 2 men who wanted the inn more than they wanted her, and she has never spoken of loneliness, though I've seen it in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking." He coughed, a deep sound in his chest that gave no sign of ending cleanly. "If you're here because she's capable and pretty, and you're lonely after what happened to your brother, I'll have to ask you to leave. I'm here because she gave me the smallest room, charged me exactly $60, and never once asked me to explain who I was, and because she's the best person I've ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that room." Walt was silent for a while. Then his voice changed. Lower, heavier. "I also know who you are. I know the Corsetti family. I read the papers. I'm old, but I'm not stupid." He looked straight into Grant's eyes. "My daughter has lived a hard life. I won't let her step into a dangerous one. What will you protect her with?" "With everything I have. Everything you have includes a great many enemies. And I've never lost." Walt looked at him for a very long time, his eyes bright in his thin face, reading Grant one last time, with the same accuracy Grant had recognized during their first meeting on the back porch. Then he said, "My girl told me to say yes. I find that I agree." Grant stood, shook Walt's hand, and went to find Fell in the kitchen. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Shaw knocked on Grant's door. Not an ordinary knock. 2 short knocks, a pause, then one more. The signal they had used for 13 years, meaning wake up now, there's trouble. Not the kind that can wait until morning. Grant opened his eyes and sat up in the same motion, the instinct of a man who had spent his whole life in a world where 2 o'clock in the morning rarely brought good news. He opened the door. Shaw stood in the hallway, phone in hand, his face expressionless in a way Grant had learned to read as very bad news. "Petrov," Shaw said. 1 word, but it was enough. Shaw handed him the phone. On the screen was a message from an unknown number, sent to Grant's private line, the one only a handful of people in the world knew, which meant Petrov had dug deeper than Grant had thought. Attached to the message were 3 photographs. The first, Fell standing in the doorway of the inn, taken from across the road with a telephoto lens, clear enough to show the streak of flour on her apron. The second, Walt, sitting in his wheelchair on the back porch, a book on his lap, afternoon sunlight on his face. A peaceful moment framed by someone who meant no good. The third, the inn from a wide angle, windows, entrance, exits, back garden, everything a professional hand would need to know if he wanted to approach. The message beneath the 3 photographs had only one line. Beautiful place, beautiful people. It would be a shame. Grant read it. He read it slowly. Then something changed. It didn't arrive gradually. It came like a switch being flipped. His eyes changed. The tired, softened light the inn had nurtured in him over 9 days, vanishing completely, replaced by something cold and flat, and very, very dangerous. His jaw tightened, his shoulders straightened, and Shaw, who had stood beside Grant Corsetti for 13 years and knew every version of this man, saw the boss return completely. Not little by little. Completely. As if the man who had fixed stairs and carried crates had only been a coat the boss had worn for a while, and now he had taken it off. "Call the council," Grant said, his voice neither rising nor falling, level as a tabletop. "Petrov just put his hand inside my house." Shaw didn't need to hear it twice. "Call Maddox and Byrne," Grant continued. "I want 4 men here before morning. Around the inn, 24/7. No one comes in, no one goes out without you knowing. And Shaw, yes, no one touches anyone in this inn. If anyone does, I'll handle it personally. Make sure Petrov understands that." Shaw nodded and disappeared down the hallway with the phone already pressed to his ear. 4 o'clock in the morning. Fel pushed open the kitchen door as she did every day, ready for the workday that began before dawn, as it had for the past 8 years. But today, the kitchen wasn't empty. Grant was sitting at the table, and the man sitting at the kitchen table wasn't the man who had carried crates and fixed her faucet. She recognized it immediately. She had watched enough kinds of people walk through the door of this inn to know when someone was dangerous, and the man before her now was dangerous in a way she had never seen in him before. Cold, completely controlled, unblinking. "Someone threatened you," he said directly. "Because of me, because I'm here." Fel stood still in the kitchen doorway. She didn't panic. She didn't step back. She set the flour sack down on the table and looked at him. "I knew who you were when I let you stay," she said. "I looked up your name on my phone on the second night. I read the news. I know what the Corsetti family is. I'm not naive, Grant." It was the first time she had called him by his name. "But you didn't sign up for this." "I didn't sign up for most of my life," she said, and her voice was steady as the stone foundation of the inn. "My mother died when I was 14. My father got sick when I was 19. I've run this place alone for 8 years. I'm not afraid of many things." She looked straight into his eyes. "But I need you to look at me and tell me the truth. Can you keep this place safe?" "I keep half the East Coast safe," he said. "I can keep an inn safe." She looked at him for another moment, measuring his answer with the intuition that had helped her read people in 2 seconds for 8 years. Then she reached for her apron, put it back on, tied the strings behind her waist, and opened the flour sack. "Then go handle it," she said. "The dough won't rise by itself." Grant began making calls at 4:15 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table of the Wren's Nest Inn, while Felicity Avery kneaded bread dough less than 2 meters away from him. The first call went to the chief financial officer of Corsetti Holdings, waking the man from sleep, and Grant didn't apologize. "Petrov is using 2 shell companies to launder money through the port," he said, his voice level, neither rising nor falling. The voice of a man reading a report, not the voice of a man destroying someone's empire. "Atlas Maritime and Eastbound Logistics. I want controlling shares in both before noon today. Use the 3rd investment fund. Leave no trail. Price doesn't matter." Fel kneaded the dough. The rhythm of her hands didn't change. The second call went to a figure inside the banking system whom Grant didn't name over the phone, using only a string of identification numbers. "I need every account linked to Petrov Holdings, and its subsidiaries frozen. Internal audit reasons. I need it done before 10 o'clock Eastern Time." The person on the other end said something. Grant listened, then answered, "I didn't ask whether it was difficult. I asked whether it will be done before 10 o'clock. Silence on the other end. Then the correct answer. Fel placed the dough into the pans. The kitchen began to grow warmer because the oven was already hot. The smell of yeast rose into the air. The third call, the fourth, the fifth, each one shorter than the last. Grant ordered the recall of 2 major loans Petrov was carrying, through a bank in which the Corsetti family held a controlling stake, moving the repayment deadline up by 90 days, which meant Petrov would have to find tens of millions of dollars while his accounts were already frozen, which meant he couldn't. In every call, Grant spoke with the same voice, low, steady, courteous, with the kind of courtesy that belonged to a man who didn't need to raise his voice, because everyone already understood the consequences. And through all of those calls, Fel baked bread. She slid the pans into the oven. She wiped the table. She washed the tools. She didn't stop, didn't listen in openly, and didn't pretend not to hear either. She was in her space, doing her work, with her rhythm, and if the man sitting 2 meters away from her was destroying the financial empire of a rival mafia boss over the phone, that was his business, while the bread still needed to rise, and the oven still needed to hold the right heat. That contrast was the strongest thing in the entire story. On one side of the table, clean financial violence, the kind of violence that didn't require guns and left no blood behind, yet was more devastating than any bullet, the kind of destruction carried out in a gentle voice over the phone at 4 o'clock in the morning. On the other side of the table, flour, butter, the smell of yeast, and the hands of the woman who had kept this inn alive with those very hands for 8 years. 2 worlds, 1 kitchen, 1 candle. Grant hung up after the final call. He set the phone down on the table. The kitchen was quiet for the first time in nearly an hour, with only the faint sound of the oven and the smell of bread beginning to fill the room, warm and soft, and belonging to the ordinary world, in a way nothing Grant had just done belonged to it. Fel opened the oven, took out the tray of bread, cut a slice, spread butter over it, and placed it on a plate in front of Grant. No comment. No question about who he had just spoken to. No question about what would happen to Petrov. No question about anything at all. Only hot bread and butter, and her steady presence in this small kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning. And Grant looked at the slice of bread, looked at Fel, looked at the kitchen with its candlelight and flour and fragrance, and he understood that his 2 worlds had just overlapped completely, and somehow she had stood at the point where they met without wavering at all. In the days that followed, once the silent financial storm had settled, and Petrov's threat was completely dismantled, the inn finally returned to its peaceful rhythm. When the kitchen once again belonged only to the scent of fresh bread instead of cold business, Grant went looking for Fel. She was doing what she always did, working, preparing, keeping the machinery of the inn running, and she looked up when he walked in and said, "What? I want to ask you something." "I know what you're asking," she said. She set the towel down. "Ask properly." Grant stood in the kitchen of the Wren's Nest Inn, surrounded by the smell of bread and rosemary and the warmth of the oven that had been burning since before dawn, and he said, "Miss Avery, Felicity, I came here demanding the most expensive room, and you sent me away. Then you gave me the cheapest room when I deserved it. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. I don't want to take you away from this place. I want to build a life with room for who you are and who I am. Will you marry me?" Fel looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and she said, "I'll answer in 3 days." 3 days. He nearly laughed. He should have known. He stayed at the inn, in the smallest room, ate the food she cooked, fixed the window that rattled in its frame, and he didn't ask again. Those 3 days weren't pride. He understood that with a clarity that surprised him. This was Fel's rhythm. She had spent her life making decisions for the inn, for her father, for everyone who walked through the door. This decision, the only decision that was entirely hers, she would make in her own time. On the second night, after Grant had gone upstairs to his room, Fel sat beside her father's bed as she did every evening, checking his medicine, adjusting his pillow. Walt took his daughter's hand. "You're afraid," he said. "Not a question. I'm not afraid of him. I know. You're afraid of leaving here. You're afraid that if you go, who will look after me? Who will keep the inn? Who will?" "Dad," Fel's voice trembled. For the first time in this entire story, her voice trembled. "Felicity," Walt said, and he held her hand tighter. "You're 27 years old. You've never had anything of your own. Never. You've run this inn, cared for me, paid the debts, all alone since you were 19. 8 years, he cried, plainly, without hiding it, tears running down his thin face. "I've watched you eat leftovers. I've watched you wear shoes with worn-down heels, I've watched you call the doctor and ask for more time to pay, and I couldn't do anything. That hurt me more than any illness ever could." Fel cried. For the first time, no sobbing, no sound, just tears moving silently down her cheeks, as if her body had finally allowed itself to release something it had held for far too long. "He saw you fix the stairs and carry the crates," Walt said, his voice breaking lightly at the end. "He saw you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. He doesn't want to rescue you, Fel. He wants to stand beside you. There's a difference. And that is the kind of man you deserve." They sat like that for a long while in the small room, hand in hand, father and daughter, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. On the morning of the third day, Grant came down for breakfast. His plate had already been set at his usual table by the window. Beside the plate was a small sprig of rosemary, the kind she had cut in the garden on the day he returned, and beneath the rosemary, on a scrap of paper torn from the ledger, in the precise handwriting he had seen every morning through his 9 days here, was a single word. "Yes." He looked up. She stood behind the counter, writing in the ledger, exactly as she did every other morning. She didn't look up. "Rosemary is for remembrance," she said, still writing, "so you won't forget what you've agreed to. I'd find that hard to forget. I'd find it hard to let you forget." She closed the ledger, and she looked at him. And for the first time since Grant had known her, Felicity Avery smiled. Not half a smile, not the faint movement of one corner of her mouth. Fully. And it was like watching sunlight enter a room that had already been beautiful by candlelight. Only now, it had become something else entirely. They were married 6 weeks later in the little church in Harlow Falls, with the whole town present, not because everyone had been invited, but because in a place that size, everyone knew everyone, and the wedding of the innkeeper was the biggest event of the year. Aldrich served as the witness, standing near the altar in a suit Grant suspected he hadn't worn since the last commencement ceremony he had attended, and he held the rings with the steady hands of a man who had lived 72 years without dropping anything important. Walt sat in his wheelchair at the head of the aisle, personally pushed into position by Shaw, and the combination of the former Marine and the old man with a heart condition in a wheelchair was something no one in Harlow Falls understood, but everyone accepted. Fel wore a simple white dress, made at a small shop in Saratoga Springs, not Fifth Avenue, not a designer gown the wife of a boss would be expected to choose. Grant didn't suggest changing it. He was learning. Walt danced one dance with his daughter, slowly, carefully. Fel bore most of her father's weight without letting anyone see it, and they turned gently across the church floor, while the whole room fell silent in the way people fall silent when they are witnessing something too real to put into words. Then Walt sat again beside the fireplace in his own inn and cried from happiness. Ordinary happiness that did not hide and did not apologize. And the whole room stayed quiet, because there are some tears that leave people with nothing to say. Catherine Corsetti came to Harlow Falls. She looked at the inn, looked at her daughter-in-law checking the vegetable garden. Her expression, in Shaw's private assessment, could have turned fresh milk into yogurt, but Fel faced Catherine with the same calm she had used on every difficult guest who had ever walked into Wren's Nest. And over 3 months, through patience and an absolute refusal to be dismissed, she earned something that wasn't exactly acceptance, but was far more than tolerance. Catherine never said she had been wrong. She simply stopped implying things. And with a woman like her, that was surrender. Wren's Nest continued. That was Fel's condition, stated plainly and without apology. Walt lived at the inn with proper caregivers, and Dr. Kessler now came for weekly visits, instead of only when there was money to call him. Grant invested through intermediaries, quietly, repairing the roof, expanding the kitchen, building additional rooms, and never once calling it charity. It was an investment. It was also the price of Fel's yes, and it was the cheapest price he had ever paid for anything of value. Time passed. Their first daughter was named May, after Fel's mother. Their second child, a son born 2 years later, was named Thomas. When Walt heard the news, he cried again, because his grandson carried the name of someone lost, because grief had finally been given a place to stand, instead of taking up the whole room. Walt died on a January evening, in the chair beside the fireplace at Wren's Nest, Dr. Kessler beside him, Fel holding her father's hand. The inn closed for 3 days, the first time in more than 40 years. Grant stood beside the grave in the Harlow Falls Cemetery and said exactly the words that needed to be said, as he had done for Tommy. But this time he didn't leave. He stood beside his wife, held her hand, and stayed. The inn continued. The new manager was a young woman from town whom Fel had trained herself. Guests still stopped on rainy nights. The best room was still the best room, and the food still followed the same recipes. The price was higher than $60, but the welcome remained unchanged. And late at night, when the children were asleep and the penthouse was quiet, Fel and Grant sat in the study. She with the account books, he with his phone and the underworld that never slept. The silence between two people who had understood each other from the first night. Now and then, he would look up and watch her write, her handwriting still as precise as ever, her concentration still absolute, and he would think of a rainy night in rural New York, and the door of an inn, and the woman who had looked at him for 2 seconds, and then sent him away. "What?" she said without looking up, because she always knew when he was watching her. "Nothing. Just remembering." "Remembering what?" "That I demanded the most expensive room, and you sent me away." She didn't smile, not exactly, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way he had memorized more deeply than his own name. "And I gave you the cheapest room when you deserved it. You still owe me the difference." He did. He always would. Some stories come with thunder and ceremony, with grand declarations and dramatic turns. But other stories arrive like shelter, quietly, without warning, carrying only warmth, dry walls, and the steady presence of someone who sees you clearly and treats you exactly as you need, not as you demand. The best room isn't always the most expensive room. Sometimes it's the smallest room, given by someone who understands what you need before you understand it yourself. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. That healing doesn't come from power or money, but from a place that doesn't demand you explain who you are, and from a person strong enough to see through you without needing you to speak. In real life, not everyone gets to meet a Felicity Avery, but each of us can become the person who gives the best room we have, through understanding, through patience, through standing beside someone instead of trying to save them. If this story has touched you in any way, I'd love to hear it. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your own life? Someone who gave you their best without you needing to ask? Or someone you wish you could stand beside a little more? Please share with me in the comments below. I always read them, and I truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like so more people can find it. Share it with a friend who needs to hear a good story tonight. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the moving stories we share every day. Thank you for staying until the very last minute. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.